Welcome again to AIT Learning Hub. My name is Tanmay Acharya. You have already heard, seen the earlier video. That was the part 1 of my series of lectures on neuroanatomy. I started with the basal ganglia, and you must have seen the earlier video, part 1 of the basal ganglia. This is the part 2 of that same video, where I'll discuss the basal ganglia further in detail and talk to you also about the direct and indirect pathways. So just to recap, the brain consists of 3 parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brain stem. The cerebrum consists of 2 halves called the cerebral hemispheres, and deep within these halves lie the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia functions as the gatekeeper for motor movements, deciding which actions to allow and which to inhibit. This is the basic structure of the basal ganglia. I have already spoken to you about this in the earlier video. I have provided the link to the earlier video in the description box. You can click into that and watch the earlier video. Now let's move on. So this is the axial T1 MRI image of the brain. So I will show you all the structures of the basal ganglia here. This is the lateral ventricle, the gray matter, the white matter, the caudate nucleus or the basal nuclei, the external capsule, the internal capsule, the lentiform nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, and the thalami. Let's examine these structures in detail. First, we have the caudate nucleus, which is shaped like the letter C. So here you can see this is the caudate nucleus. This is shaped like the letter C. The caudate nucleus can be divided into 3 parts: the head, the body, and the tail. So this is the head of the caudate nucleus, this is the body of the caudate nucleus, and this is the tail of the caudate nucleus. It runs alongside the lateral ventricle of the brain, which is located medially to it, and curves around the thalamus. So it runs alongside the lateral ventricle of the brain. So this caudate nucleus runs alongside, this is the lateral ventricle of the brain. So it runs alongside the lateral ventricle of the brain, which is located medially to it and curves around the thalamus. This is the thalamus, and it is curving around the thalamus. Laterally, the caudate nucleus is bordered by the internal capsule. So here I will show you in this image that this is the caudate nucleus, and you see laterally this is the internal capsule which borders the caudate nucleus. See, this is the darkish part here is the internal capsule, and this borders the caudate nucleus. In a crosswise section of the brain, you can see the head forming the outer wall of the front part of the lateral ventricle. In a coronal section, the body of the caudate can be observed along the wall of the body of the lateral ventricle. The caudate tail curves around the back end of the thalamus and continues along the bottom part of the lateral ventricle, forming the roof. So this is here again in this MRI image. I am just trying to show you the head. This is basically the head of the caudate nucleus. This is the body, and this is the tail. See, this looks like the letter C. This is the caudate nucleus. Now, the caudate body is visible along the lateral ventricle's wall on a coronal section. The caudate tail curves around the posterior end of the thalamus and extends along the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, forming its roof. This I have already spoken to you in the earlier slide. The putamen, globus pallidus externus and internus are collectively referred to as the lentiform nucleus, which is a wedge-shaped nucleus with a wide base pointing laterally. In the brain's transverse and coronal sections, the internal capsule is located towards the middle, dividing the lentiform nucleus from the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. On the outside of the lentiform nucleus lies the external capsule. Here, this is the lentiform nucleus, this is the internal capsule which divides the caudate nucleus and basically surrounding the caudate nucleus, and this is the external capsule. Thin layers of white matter run vertically through the lentiform nucleus, splitting it into 3 parts. The innermost nucleus is the globus pallidus. So, globus pallidus is here, this is the innermost nucleus, which appears lighter due to its higher concentration of myelinated nerve fibers. Then the globus pallidus is further divided by a sheet of white matter into the globus pallidus internus, located next to the internal capsule, and globus pallidus externus, situated closer to the putamen. So, this globus pallidus is again further divided by a sheet of white matter into internus and externus. The putamen is the outermost of the lentiform nuclei and appear darker. It is positioned lateral to the globus pallidus externus and medial to the external capsule. The putamen and the caudate nucleus are often referred to as the corpus striatum. So, the putamen and caudate nucleus together are called as the corpus striatum, or you can even call it just the striatum. These two nuclei are separated by the internal capsule, except at the front where the head of the caudate nucleus connects with the putamen. And above this connection, there are small bridges of grey matter passing through the internal capsule between these nuclei, giving it a striated appearance. This is why it is called as corpus striatum. Now, let's shift our focus to another nuclei closely related to the basal ganglia. In the midbrain, between the tegmentum and the crus cerebri, there is a darkly pigmented area known as the substantia nigra. So, this is in the midbrain, a darkly pigmented area. This is known as the substantia nigra. It contains cells that store granules filled with a pigment called neuromelanin, giving this region a darker color. So, this substantia nigra is dark basically due to the presence of the pigment called neuromelanin, and substantia nigra is in the midbrain. Now, this substantia nigra can be divided into 2 parts. The substantia nigra pars compacta, or SNPC. Remember these abbreviations, because later on we will see how these are responsible in the direct and indirect pathways. And the substantia nigra pars reticulata, or SNPR. The SNPC contains dopaminergic neurons that project their axons to the corpus striatum, forming the nigrostriatal pathway where they release dopamine. Then there is the subthalamus, a part of the diencephalon located ventral to the thalamus, lateral to the hypothalamus, and medial to the internal capsule. If you are having trouble with understanding what is ventral, what is lateral, what is medial, I will advise you to go back and watch the video by Bhumika Esanan, and she has explained all anatomical positions very nicely, so it will be easier for you to understand that. It contains the subthalamic nuclei, or the short form for it is STN, which assists the basal ganglia in regulating movements. The STN receives afferent fibers from the globus pallidus externus and projects efferent fibers to the globus pallidus internus. Now that we have covered the main basal nuclei, let's see how they work together to assist the motor cortex in the movement. Now, to pass messages between each other, neurons of the basal nuclei use neurotransmitters. So, neurotransmitters are the messengers which pass message from between each other. They either release excitatory neurotransmitters neurotransmitters like glutamate or inhibitory neurotransmitters like gamma amino butyric acid or GABA. The basal ganglia do not have any direct connection with the lower motor neurons. So, they cannot contain the muscles, rather they cannot control the muscles directly. However, they influence the motor cortex through the thalamus. So, the basal ganglia directly cannot control the muscle movement. So, they instead influence the motor cortex through the thalamus. Okay. Information enters the basal ganglia through the corpus striatum and leaves it through the globus pallidus internus or GPI for short, which has an output to the thalamus. The information flow can follow two different pathways, the direct pathway and the indirect pathway. The normal connectivity of the direct pathway results in excitation of the motor cortex, while the normal connectivity of the indirect pathway results in inhibition of the motor cortex. To remember which pathway produces which effect, just recall indirect inhibits the motor cortex. So, if you are like direct pathway is for excitation and indirect pathway for inhibition. So, in of indirect and in of inhibition. So, you should remember indirect pathway inhibition. Now, to better understand how they function, let us dive into both of these pathways step by step. So, the direct pathway starts with the substantia nigra pars compacta, which contains neurons that project to the corpus striatum. These neurons release dopamine from their axons, which binds to D1 receptors found on the neurons of the corpus striatum. Neurons that have D1 receptors project directly to the GPI and inhibit it in releasing GABA. Normally, the GPI projects to the thalamus where it releases GABA, thus inhibiting the thalamus and preventing it from releasing glutamate and resulting in and stimulating the motor cortex. However, because GPI is inhibited by the corpus striatum, the thalamus is then disinhibited and can stimulate the motor cortex, thereby assisting with initiation and execution of the desired voluntary movement. If you have any difficulty in understanding this direct pathway, you can get back to me or keep watching the video again and again. It will be easier for you to understand. I have made it very simple to understand the direct pathway. At the same time the direct pathway is activated, the information also passes through the indirect pathway. Okay. The indirect pathway also begins with the neurons of the SNPC that project to the corpus striatum, where they release dopamine. Okay. This time dopamine binds to the D2 receptors found on the neurons that projects to the GPE first. Once activated, these neurons release GABA, which inhibits the globus pallidus externus or the GPE for short. Normally, the GPE projects to the subthalamic nuclei or the STN and releases GABA to inhibit it. This prevents the STN from releasing glutamate and stimulating the GPI. But because GP has been inhibited by the indirect pathway, the STN breaks free and starts releasing glutamate to stimulate the GPI. This excitation causes the GPI to release more GABA, which inhibits the thalamus and results in inhibition of the motor cortex. So even though it might seem like the indirect pathway wants to sabotage the direct pathway, it helps the motor cortex by suppressing unwanted muscle contractions while producing voluntary movements. I hope you have understood the basics of the basal ganglia, the anatomy of the basal ganglia, a bit about how to locate the basal ganglia on an MRI image, where is the external capsule, where is the internal capsule, lentiform nucleus, caudate nucleus, as well as I hope you would have also understood the direct and the indirect pathway. So I will advise you to go through this video several times. It will be sometimes a bit difficult for you to understand. Refer to books and draw yourself the direct and indirect pathway, and it'll like, you will understand how this direct and indirect pathway and the excitation and inhibitions of the motor inhibition of unwanted muscle contractions ultimately helps the human body in moving the muscles they want the way they want it to. Thank you again for your time, and I will ask you guys if you to subscribe to our channel and comment how you like the content of our channel. If you want something else to be like, further videos on some other topic, you want me to explain anything on this topic further, I'm happy enough to do it. Thank you for your time.